Well, that is like the entire gospel in a chapter. So let me just focus us for a moment on the last part of that passage. Do not despise prophecies, but test everything. Hold fast what is good. Abstain from every form of evil. I know that salvation is of God, but I also know, mainly because I learned it from books, that there are other kinds of salvations too, everyday gifts, and that God uses the things of this earth to teach us and shape us and to help us find truth. One such gift to me is that my soul was entrusted to two good parents. One, a mother who loves books and who read consistently to her children as we were growing up. Just as weekly attendance at church and Sunday school was part of what it meant to belong to my family, so too was my mother reading to each of us, my two older brothers and me, every night at bedtime. These rituals were part of our lives well past the age when most of my friends were no longer tucked into bed or read to or made to go to church by their parents. Even into my brother's teen years, our mother made the rounds to each separate bedroom, reading a section nightly from the books of our choosing. Although not every child raised on books grows up to be a voracious reader, the early inculcation of this habit increases the chances. Likewise, although being raised by God-loving parents is no guarantee that one will love God oneself, it certainly does help. And I did love God, even if it didn't always show, but for much of my life, I loved books more than God. I never discovered for a long, long time that a God who spoke the world into existence with words is, in fact, the source of meaning of all words. I thought for a long time that my love of books was taking me away from God. But as it turns out, books were the backwoods path back to God, bramble-filled and broken, yes, but full of truth and wonder. Books and the reading of books fill the memories of my early childhood as much as anything else. My childhood rituals of reading encompassed a complicated set of ceremonies, rules, and traditions not unlike those of the church. Church stifled me, but books made my world feel bigger and made me feel freer. Some of these books took me to places most people would say a young girl shouldn't go. But my parents never restricted my reading, unlike many parents today who seem to spend a lot of time fretting over what to allow their kids to read or not to read. That seems to me to be an entirely negative, not to mention ineffective strategy, this shielding of children from reality rather than actively exposing them to the sort of truth that emerges organically from the give and take of weighing and reckoning competing ideas against one another. Discovering truth, after all, is a process that occurs over time, more fully with each idea or each book that gets added to the equation. And this is why I think books should be promiscuously read. These are the words of John Milton in his famous 1644 anti-censorship tract called Areopagitica. Today, of course, the word promiscuous is usually associated with sexual behavior, but this is a more recent usage, one that comes from the word's actual meaning, which is indiscriminate mixing. It's easy, of course, to see the sexual application of the meaning of the word from the definition, but instructive to think about it in the context of reading and learning. It's surprising, I think, to realize that such a pious and scholarly and conservative Puritan like Milton actually argued for indiscriminate, disorderly reading, and lots of it. In Milton's day, people had many more fears surrounding promiscuous reading than promiscuous sex, because the latter was rarer, so Milton had quite a challenge ahead of him when he wrote this treatise. He wrote it in the midst of the English Civil Wars, when the price for a wrong-headed idea might well be one's head. Milton argued passionately in this treatise that the best way to counteract falsehood is not by suppressing it, but by countering it with truth. It's actually, as a side note, it's helpful for me in this political day and age, with one election having just recently passed and previous elections in the past couple of years causing so much turmoil and strife and polarization, if we look back at history and we see that the acrimony many of us face every day on social media, Twitter especially, as hard as it is, isn't anything like losing your head or being burned at the stake. People before us, Christians before us, have lived through much more polarized times than we have. That's not an excuse, but maybe there is some comfort there. The essence of Milton's argument in his tract was that truth is actually stronger than falsehood. Falsehood prevails through the suppression of countering ideas, but truth triumphs in a free and open exchange that allows it to shine. This was, I think, looking back, the essence of my parents' approach to my reading, though they didn't express it this way. My parents hadn't ever read Milton, but they had good instincts and a good dose of common sense, and I'm thankful for that. So while Milton wrote Areopagitica in a context that is far removed chronologically and politically from our United States, and in particular our Constitution, his argument against the licensing orders of the 17th century English government was instrumental in shaping our own First Amendment. Milton's stance is even more significant when one considers that he was arguing against the policies and strategies of his own political faction. He was writing to his own people, not his political and theological opponents. Milton demonstrated the universal power of truth not only in the content of his treatise, but also in the very act of countering his fellow Christians, his fellow believers, his own party. By standing for truth against even his own party, Milton embodied the very power of truth. Milton thus exemplifies the person, the believer of integrity, whose allegiance is to truth rather than to comfort, to doctrine rather than to political or social expediency. Something I think all of us struggle with in the climate today. But even outside of Milton's own context as a 17th century Puritan, his argument for promiscuous reading is instructive today because such an approach is still both the means and the mark of the intellectually and spiritually mature person. In making his argument, as a churchman speaking to fellow churchmen, Milton cited the biblical examples of Moses, Daniel, and Paul, who were all steeped in the writings of their own surrounding pagan cultures. Milton also invoked a leader of the third century church who asserted that God told him in a vision, quote, "Read any books whatever come into your hands, for you are sufficient both to judge aright and to examine each matter," end quote. This advice mirrors the Pauline suggestion that we just read to test all things and hold fast to that which is good. In Areopagitica, Milton puts it very profoundly when he says, and I'm going to quote here, it's 17th century English, so bear with me, bear with Milton, and I'll probably repeat it because it's so good. This is Milton. Well knows he who uses to consider that our faith and knowledge thrives by exercise as well as our limbs and complexion. Truth is compared in Scripture to a streaming fountain. If her waters flow not in a perpetual progression, they sicken into a muddy pool of conformity and tradition. A man may be a heretic in the truth, and if he believes things only because his pastor says so, or the assembly so determines, without knowing other reason, though his belief be true, yet the very truth he holds becomes his heresy, end quote. I think that's, it's important and helpful for us to think about those words for a few minutes. Of course, Milton was writing in a context where he was taking shots at the Catholic Church that his Puritan tradition was formed against. And so some of those words that have to do with conformity and tradition reflect his anti-Catholic views. But, you know, as a Protestant, I find wisdom in this, regardless of our faith tradition. So often it's so easy to simply believe something because it is what our church has taught us, or what our pastor has taught us, or our parents have taught us. And those things could be true, but as the scripture admonishes, we must test them in order to see if they are true. Otherwise, as Milton says, they can actually become heresy. In other words, according to Milton, the power of truth lies not in abstract propositions, but in the understanding and willful application of truth by living, breathing persons, which can occur best, perhaps only, within the context of liberty. Indeed, for Milton, this necessary freedom is seen in the character of God himself. For God is not, Milton argues, one to captivate his children under a perpetual childhood of prescription or rules, but rather, God expects us to exercise reason, wisdom, and virtue. He asks, what wisdom can there be to choose without knowledge of evil? What praise for a fugitive and cloistered virtue, unexercised and unbreathed, that never sallies out and sees his adversary, but slinks out of the race where that immortal garland is to be run for, not without dust and heat. In other words, Milton here, as in other of his writings, is distinguishing between virtue, which is choosing good over bad, and innocence, which is simply not being exposed to any bad choices from which to choose. Milton continues by saying, those who imagine to remove sin by removing the matter of sin have a poor understanding of human nature and the human condition. Again, it's one thing to choose good, another to have no choice to make. But beyond the practical uses of truth in exercising virtue and cultivating our maturity, Milton waxes most eloquently when he describes as the very nature of truth itself. Again, a long quote, which is really worth attending to. Milton says, "For who knows not that truth is strong next to the Almighty? She needs no policies, nor stratagems, nor licensings to make her victorious. Those are the shifts and the defenses that error uses against her power. Give her but room, and do not bind her when she sleeps. And though all the winds of doctrine were let loose to play upon the earth, so truth be in the field, we do injuriously by licensing and prohibiting to misdoubt her strength. Let her and falsehood grapple. Whoever knew truth put to the worse in a free and open encounter. Her confuting is the best and surest suppressing." In other words, Milton is saying that truth is so powerful that all truth needs is the level playing field of being able to counter falsehood. That's something for us to consider as we engage, again, in social media or conversation or debate or discussion. We don't need to amplify or decorate or embellish the truth of our positions, the truth of our politics. We don't need to use clickbait, or shouldn't do that. If we believe that our positions and our politics are truthful, they need no such embellishment, and they need not suppress falsehoods in order to expose those falsehoods as such. When I read John Milton, it helped me to understand, and I was well into my graduate studies by then, it helped me to understand the antagonism I had always felt while growing up, an antagonism between the life of the church and the life of the mind, and it helped me to see that that antagonism was actually false. Why had this truth been obscured for me so long? Why had it seemed hidden from me by the church? I'm not clear about where my perception of this antagonism came from, whether it was from the surrounding culture, from politics, from bad preaching, or from all of the above. But the fact was, I finally realized that there was and is no essential conflict between the tenets of my faith and the freedom of the mind. The oppression I had felt in the church as I was growing up about books and reading and thinking was of human origin not divine. So while it was that I asked Jesus into my heart before I was even 5 years old, it was many years before I asked him into my mind. In fairness to myself, it was a long time before I realized that my mind was a place where Jesus not only needed to be, but wanted to be. And reading so many books is what made it clear to me. The book of Matthew records Jesus as saying, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind." I didn't accomplish or attain all of these loves at once. In fact, I seem to have followed the order of this verse. First, loving Jesus with my child's heart, a love there in the middle of me, tucked safely away, but hidden in the compartments I'd conveniently made for myself and my life. Eventually, that love seeped outward, filling the core of my being, my soul. I'd never really had a serious crisis of faith, but I didn't know until I began to love God with my mind that my faith had really been sleeping all those years. And John Milton wakened it. It's a blessing, a mercy really, that I've never struggled with doubt. I've never struggled with doubt about God's existence or the truth of the Bible or the witness and teachings of the historic church. I know that's not true of everyone, and that's fine. I've just never really had that struggle. But I have faced doubt. I have faced doubt through the disbelief of others, through the questions and honest searching of minds far greater than mine across the ages and on the pages and in the words of the writers I have read. Thomas Hardy, Emily Dickinson, Matthew Arnold, Blaise Pascal, Friedrich Nietzsche, Samuel Beckett, Boethius, Soren Kierkegaard, Dante, Shakespeare, Peter, Job, so many more. To be sure, I have had questions of my own, and I have grappled with questions alongside others. People sometimes journey from faith to doubt, and I've known plenty of such people. Some of these people have come back to the faith. Others have not. Others I have known began in doubt or unbelief and eventually came to faith. My own faith journey has been slow at times, yet pretty steady and straight. But it has not been a blind faith. I have struggled against God, again, not as some do, but still I did in my own way. I didn't doubt his being, but I doubted his ways. I doubted that his ways were better than my ways. I doubted the ways of his people too, plenty of that. Even so, I wonder more that an airplane can fly than that the God of the universe exists. Granted, my doubt in airplanes is rooted in my ignorance of physics, but I think the same might apply to our understanding of God. My struggle against God's ways really ultimately only reinforced my belief in him. After all, one doesn't struggle against something someone doesn't believe in. One doesn't rail against someone one thinks does not exist. Reading promiscuously has humbled me in showing that there is nothing new under the sun. As real and as important as any questions I have might be, I've seen that they aren't unique to me. There is comfort in this and chastening too. The books I have read over a lifetime have shaped my worldview, my beliefs, and my life as much as anything else. From Great Expectations, I learned that the power of the stories we tell ourselves has to do us either harm or good, and harm and good to ourselves or to others. From Death of a Salesman, which I'll talk about a little bit more tonight, I learned the dangers of a corrupt version of the American dream. From Madame Bovary, I learned to embrace the real world rather than escaping into flights of fancy. From Gulliver's Travels, I learned the profound limitations of my own finite perspective. And from Jane Eyre, I learned how to be myself. These and so many, many other books have helped me to test worldly ideas and to test biblical ideas and to test experiences of my own and others against God, against his word, and to ultimately hold fast to what is good. May you find the same to be true in reading promiscuously as that wise Puritan divine exhorted us to do so many years ago. Let me just pray a blessing on you as we end today's chapel. Lord, I pray that you would help us to test all things, to abstain from evil and cling to what is good. I pray that you would help us to use our minds to do this testing and help our souls to be the crucible through which we live out the results of this testing, Lord. I pray that you would help us to keep us faithful and strong, to not be afraid of doubt, but even more, not to be afraid of truth either. We ask for your blessings on this day and this time together. In the name of Christ, amen. You are dismissed.